Eleanor Parker stood in front of the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The ivory wedding gown she had dreamed of since she was a child hugged her figure perfectly, and the soft waves of her auburn hair cascaded beneath her veil. Everything was as she had planned. The perfect dress, the perfect venue, the perfect man waiting for her at the altar. Yet, as she adjusted the delicate lace on her sleeves, a weight settled in her chest, an unease she couldn't quite explain. At her feet, Bruno, her loyal German shepherd of 13 years, lay with his head resting on his paws. His amber eyes followed her every move with an intensity that felt different today. For years, he had been her constant companion, from high school heartbreaks to late-night study sessions in college. She had rescued him from a shelter when he was just an underfed pup, and in return, he had rescued her in more ways than she could count. "Bruno, what do you think?" Eleanor murmured, smoothing the folds of her gown as she glanced down at him. "Is Jonathan a keeper?" His ears twitched at the sound of her fiancé's name, but he remained unusually still. Normally, at any mention of Jonathan, Bruno would perk up, tail wagging in excitement. Today, however, he didn't move, just watched her, his breathing slow but deep, his eyes dark pools of something she couldn't quite read. A knock at the door startled her. "Sweetheart, the makeup artist is here. Are you ready?" Her mother's voice called. Eleanor tore her gaze away from Bruno. "Coming, Mom," she replied, giving him one last scratch behind his ears. "Come on, boy, let's go make me a bride." Bruno stood, but something about his movement made her pause. His joints, once spry and strong, seemed to creak under the weight of his own body. A pang of sadness struck her. He was getting old. But there was something else, something off. His posture was rigid, his eyes never leaving her. Shrugging off the unease, Eleanor gathered her skirts and followed her mother down the hallway. Yet as she reached the front door, Bruno suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Bruno, move," she said, laughing nervously, trying to guide him aside. But he didn't budge. Instead, he pressed against her legs, his body tense, his breath heavier than before. Her heart thumped faster. Something was wrong. Eleanor's laughter faltered as Bruno remained firmly planted in front of her, his broad body blocking the doorway. His stance was unwavering, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't playful defiance. This was something else. "Bruno, come on," she coaxed, her voice light but edged with unease. She reached down to nudge him aside, but instead of yielding, he pressed even closer, his weight heavy against her legs. His breath was warm against the fabric of her gown, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt off. From behind, her mother's voice cut through the moment. "Eleanor, we need to go. The photographer is waiting, and traffic might be bad." "I know, just—" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers instinctively running through Bruno's thick fur. His body felt unusually warm, almost feverish, his ears, always alert, drooped slightly. She felt the subtle tremor in his legs as he leaned into her. "Maybe he needs a walk," her maid of honor, Claire, suggested, stepping forward. She reached for Bruno's leash, but the moment she did, he pressed even harder into Eleanor, nearly causing her to stumble backward. "Bruno, stop!" she gasped, steadying herself against the doorframe. Her pulse quickened, not from frustration, but from something deeper, something raw and unspoken. Bruno had always been protective of her, but this was different. This wasn't excitement or loyalty. This was fear. The murmurs around her grew louder. Her mother sighed, checking her watch with growing impatience. The bridesmaids exchanged glances. The wedding planner whispered into her headset, undoubtedly trying to keep everything on schedule. But none of it mattered. Eleanor's world had narrowed down to the dog standing before her, his body vibrating with silent urgency. Then she saw it. His breathing, just slightly too fast. The way his sides rose and fell with more effort than usual. The faint tremor running through his legs. Something was wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest. The rational part of her mind told her this was ridiculous. It was her wedding day. Hundreds of guests were waiting. Jonathan was waiting. But another voice, the one deep in her gut, the one that had always guided her, screamed at her to listen. Eleanor knelt down, ignoring the lace of her dress pooling around her. She placed both hands on Bruno's face, looking into those deep, knowing eyes. "Are you trying to tell me something, boy?" she whispered. Bruno let out a soft whimper, and in that moment, Eleanor knew. She couldn't walk out that door. Not yet. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she stroked Bruno's fur, feeling the unsteady rhythm of his breathing beneath her touch. The whispers around her grew louder, her mother's voice cutting through the tension. "Eleanor, we have to go. The guests are waiting." But Eleanor barely heard her. Her world had shrunk to the dog in front of her, the loyal companion who had been with her through every heartbreak, every milestone, every quiet moment of solace. And now, in the most important moment of her life, he was asking for her attention, not with barks or frantic movements, but with the weight of his presence, the silent plea in his eyes. A knot formed in her throat as she realized what he'd been trying to tell her all along. "Something's wrong," she said, barely above a whisper. Claire crouched beside her, her gaze shifting between Eleanor and Bruno. "You think he's sick?" Eleanor nodded, her gut twisting. "I should have seen it earlier. He's been eating less, moving slower. I thought it was just his age, but this isn't normal." Her mother exhaled sharply. "Honey, I know you love that dog, but this is your wedding day. The vet can wait until after the ceremony." "No," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly firm. She met her mother's eyes, her heart pounding. "He's been there for me through everything. I promised him I'd always be there for him too. I can't just ignore this." Her father stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Eleanor swallowed hard. She could picture Jonathan at the altar, the guests filling the pews, the music that was supposed to start playing in just a few minutes. But none of it mattered in this moment. What mattered was the friend who had never let her down, the one who had always put her first. "I need to take him to the vet," she said, standing up. "Right now." A hush fell over the group. Her mother opened her mouth to argue, but her father spoke first. "Go," he said simply. "I'll call Jonathan. He'll understand." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" He smiled gently. "That dog is family, Eleanor, and you don't abandon family when they need you." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, then turned to Claire. "Can you drive me?" "Absolutely." Without another glance at the waiting limousine, Eleanor gathered her gown and rushed toward the car. Bruno pressed against her side, his body heavy but trusting. She didn't know what the vet would say. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she needed to be. Eleanor sat in the backseat of Claire's car, her wedding gown pooled around her like a storm of ivory lace. Her hands clutched Bruno's fur, her fingers lightly pressing against his chest, feeling every labored breath he took. The familiar, rhythmic rise and fall she had always found comforting now felt uneven, fragile. She swallowed hard, pushing away the wave of panic rising in her throat. Claire gripped the steering wheel, eyes locked on the road, weaving through traffic with a speed and urgency that matched Eleanor's heartbeat. "We're almost there," she assured, glancing in the rearview mirror. Eleanor barely registered the words. Her mind was racing. Had she waited too long? Had she been so caught up in wedding plans that she'd ignored the signs? Bruno had always been strong, his presence a constant force in her life. But now, as he leaned against her, his weight heavier than ever, she felt the bitter sting of realization. He had been trying to tell her something for days, and she hadn't listened. She bent over, pressing her forehead gently to his. "Just hold on, buddy. We're getting you help." Bruno let out a slow, heavy exhale, his tail thumping once, weak, but reassuring. The car screeched to a stop in front of Dr. Wallace's veterinary clinic, the sight of the familiar building flooding Eleanor with both relief and dread. Claire barely had time to shift into park before Eleanor threw open the door, gathering her gown in one hand while carefully guiding Bruno out with the other. The automatic doors slid open, the scent of antiseptic and fur hitting her as she stepped inside. A receptionist, mid-conversation, froze at the sight before her. A woman in a wedding dress, veil slightly askew, gripping the collar of an aging German shepherd who looked like he was barely holding himself up. "I need help," Eleanor's voice cracked, but there was no hesitation in her tone. "It's Bruno. His breathing is off. His heart's racing. Please, I need someone to see him now." The receptionist sprang into action, waving over a vet tech. "Dr. Wallace is in the back. Get them into exam room 2. Eleanor felt a hand on her back, Claire steadying her. "You're doing the right thing." She nodded, but inside, fear gnawed at her. She had made her choice, left behind her wedding, her guests, the perfect day she had spent months planning. Now, she just had to pray she wasn't too late. Eleanor sat on the cold tile floor of the exam room, her pristine wedding dress now wrinkled and spread around her like a forgotten relic of a different life. Her fingers ran through Bruno's fur, feeling the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He was exhausted. She could see it in the way his body sagged against her, in the labored breaths that rattled slightly with each inhale. She had been so close to walking down the aisle, so close to saying, "I do." But none of that mattered now. The door creaked open, and Dr. Wallace stepped in, his expression carefully measured. He crouched down beside them, pressing a stethoscope to Bruno's chest, listening in silence. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly it nearly drowned out the sterile beeping of the machines beyond the door. Finally, he exhaled, setting the stethoscope aside. "Eleanor," he said gently, "it's his heart. He's showing signs of advanced cardiac disease. His body has been compensating for a while, but today, with all the excitement, it became too much." Her fingers curled into Bruno's fur. But he was fine just a few days ago. Dr. Wallace shook his head. "With older dogs, these things can progress quickly. He's been trying to tell you something, and today, he made sure you heard him." Eleanor's throat tightened, guilt pressed heavy against her ribs. She had been so caught up in the perfect wedding, in making sure every detail was flawless, that she hadn't noticed the one thing that truly mattered. Bruno had been slipping away right in front of her. A knock at the door startled her, and when she turned, her breath caught. Jonathan stood there, still in his tuxedo, his tie slightly loosened, his best man Kevin behind him. His gaze softened the moment he saw her sitting on the floor, cradling Bruno. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked in and knelt beside her. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "The wedding." Jonathan reached for her hand, shaking his head. "None of that matters." His voice was steady, unwavering. "This is what matters." A lump formed in her throat as she searched his face. There was no frustration, no disappointment, only love. Then Kevin cleared his throat. "Actually, we might have an idea." Eleanor blinked. "What?" Jonathan smiled. "How do you feel about getting married right here?" Eleanor stared at Jonathan, her breath catching in her throat. "Here?" she whispered, glancing around the small, sterile exam room. The walls were lined with shelves of medical supplies. A faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, and the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. This wasn't the grand church she had envisioned, with towering stained glass windows and rows of elegantly dressed guests. But when she looked down at Bruno, his tired eyes watching her, she realized none of that mattered. Jonathan gently squeezed her hand. "We don't need the venue, the flowers, or the music. We just need each other." A soft knock interrupted them, and Claire peeked in, her eyes glistening. "Your parents are on board. The minister is on his way." Eleanor swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the way everyone had come together without hesitation. In the span of an hour, her carefully planned wedding had unraveled. But in its place, something even more beautiful was taking shape. As the veterinary staff hurried to clear space, her mother appeared, holding a small compact mirror. "At least let me fix your makeup," she murmured, brushing away Eleanor's tears before dabbing a bit of powder on her face. Her father stepped forward, straightening his tie. "I never imagined walking you down the aisle in a vet clinic," he chuckled, though his voice held a slight tremor. "But I think this is exactly where you're supposed to be." The minister arrived moments later, standing at the front of the small waiting area where chairs had been hastily arranged. The few people who mattered most, her parents, Claire, Kevin, and a handful of veterinary staff, gathered in quiet anticipation. Eleanor turned toward Jonathan, and for the first time that day, she felt truly at peace. He reached for her hands, his touch warm and steady. As the minister began, Bruno shifted beside them, his head resting against her dress, his breathing steady. When the time came for their vows, Jonathan looked into her eyes. "I promise to love you through every unexpected turn, through every imperfect moment. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up when it matters most." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks as she whispered her vows in return. When the minister finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Jonathan leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her lips. A weak but unmistakable woof echoed from below, making everyone laugh through their tears. Bruno had given his blessing. The months that followed were both precious and painful. Eleanor and Jonathan cherished every moment with Bruno, knowing their time with him was slipping away. They adjusted their schedules, took turns staying home on his bad days, and made sure he was never alone. The medication helped for a while, giving him brief moments of renewed energy, but they could see the inevitable approaching. His once playful demeanor softened into quiet companionship. His movements grew slower, and the once lively tail wags became gentle, tired flicks. Then, one evening in early spring, Bruno let them know it was time. The day had been peaceful. He had eaten well, spent time in the backyard soaking in the afternoon sun, and even nudged his favorite toy around with his nose. But as night fell, a change settled over him. He became restless, moving between Eleanor and Jonathan, as if checking on them one last time. Eleanor noticed the shift immediately. His breathing was more labored, his body heavier against her touch. She knelt beside him, stroking his graying muzzle. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We're right here." Jonathan called Dr. Wallace, who arrived at their home within the hour. The vet's expression was kind but solemn as he examined Bruno. "He's ready," he said softly. "We can help him pass peacefully, surrounded by the people he loves." Eleanor's throat tightened, her vision blurring. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of it. Jonathan settled onto the floor beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We won't let him be scared," he murmured. Bruno sighed deeply, resting his head in Eleanor's lap. His eyes, though tired, still held the same unwavering love they had from the day she had brought him home. She bent down, pressing her forehead to his, her tears slipping into his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything, for always being there, for choosing me." Dr. Wallace gave them a moment before administering the injection. Eleanor and Jonathan held Bruno close, whispering words of love as his breathing slowed. His body relaxed, his chest rising one last time before settling into stillness. Silence filled the room. Eleanor felt Jonathan's arms tighten around her as a quiet sob escaped her lips. Bruno was gone, but his love, his loyalty, his presence would never truly leave her. A year had passed since Bruno's final farewell, yet his presence still lingered in every corner of their home. His old bed remained by the fireplace, untouched. His leash still hung by the door. Some nights, Eleanor could almost hear the soft padding of his paws across the wooden floor, a phantom comfort that both soothed and ached. But grief, she had learned, was not about forgetting. It was about carrying love forward. On a crisp autumn morning, she and Jonathan stood outside Riverside Animal Shelter, the very place where she had first met Bruno all those years ago. Her fingers curled around the locket at her neck, a tiny photo of him inside. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew one thing for certain. Bruno had taught her that love, once given, should never be locked away. Jonathan squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do this today," he said gently. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "I want to." Inside, the familiar scent of the shelter filled her lungs, disinfectant, warm fur, and something else, something intangible. Hope. The sound of barking and soft whimpers echoed through the space as they walked past rows of kennels, filled with eyes pleading for a second chance. And then, at the very end of the row, she saw him. A senior golden retriever lay curled on a worn blanket, his muzzle dusted with gray. He wasn't like the young, energetic pups that bounced against their cage doors, vying for attention. Instead, he watched her quietly, his brown eyes gentle yet filled with a lifetime of stories. The name on the card read, Duke. Age 10. The shelter worker approached, offering a sad smile. "Most people overlook the older dogs," she said. "Duke's been here for months. His family had to surrender him when they moved into a nursing facility." Eleanor knelt, pressing her hand to the kennel door. Duke slowly lifted his head, then, with deliberate effort, got up and padded toward her. His nose pressed against her palm. A silent introduction, a quiet question. Tears blurred her vision. "He's perfect," she whispered. Jonathan crouched beside her, watching Duke with understanding. "He needs a home," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "And we have more love to give." That evening, as Duke settled into Bruno's old bed by the fire, Eleanor felt something inside her settle too. This wasn't replacing, this was continuing. Bruno had led her here, and love, once again, had found its way home. Love in its purest form is selfless. It does not measure time, nor does it demand perfection. It simply exists, unwavering and unconditional. Eleanor had learned this through Bruno, through the way he had stood by her side in every chapter of her life, and through the final lesson he had given her. Love is not about holding on, but about knowing when to let go and carrying that love forward. Animals like Bruno ask for so little: a warm place to rest, a gentle hand, a heart willing to listen. Yet, in return, they give everything. Their loyalty is absolute, their love boundless, and too often they are abandoned when they need us most. The old, the sick, the forgotten, left behind because their time is running out. But love is not measured in years. It is measured in moments, in trust built, in lives touched. By choosing to love, to adopt, to protect, we honor the silent guardians who give us everything without expecting anything in return. Eleanor and Jonathan knew that they couldn't change the world for every animal. But for Duke, just like for Bruno before him, they could change one world completely. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered.